Hello, everyone, and welcome to Shelter and Solidarity, a deep dive with artists, authors, and activists during this COVID pandemic. I'm your co-host, Linda Liu, Zoomcasting here from Dorchester, Massachusetts. And today's conversation is on the subject of confronting anti-Asian racism and building community resistance. The guests we have lined up today all have deep community organizing experience, and I'm very excited to learn more about their perspectives on this topic. Joining us from Houston, Texas today is our guest co-host, Alice Liu. Alice, thanks for being here with us today.
Yeah, so happy to be here. Thank you, Linda.
I'm delighted she's co-hosting with me today to delve deep on this topic. Alice is one of the co-directors of West Street Recovery, a horizontally organized grassroots group using rebuild and recovery efforts after disaster to build community power. Alice is a climate justice organizer who believes liberation of people of color in the US and around the world, as well as in building an economic system outside of capitalism, are fundamental to a just and livable future. Before West Street, Alice worked at the Gulf Coast Area Labor Federation, providing communication support for labor unions in the Houston area. Our other esteemed guests today are Michael Liu. Hello, Michael. Thanks for joining us today.
Hello, everyone. Glad to be here.
And Kent Wong. Hi, Kent. Thanks for being part of our conversation.
Great to be with everybody tonight. Thank you.
All right, so Michael Liu is a native of Boston, Chinatown. After graduating from college, he has been active on social justice and community issues, especially concerning Boston, Chinatown. He was a founding member of several community justice, social justice groups, including the Chinese Progressive Association, Boston, the API movement, and the Boston Rainbow Coalition. In the 1990s, he was executive director of the Asian American Resource Workshop. He is currently active with the Activist Training Institute, working with young organizers and occasionally volunteers at AARW and CPA. He received his PhD in public policy at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, which is actually where I teach, and worked as a researcher at the Institute for Asian American Studies at UMass Boston until his retirement. He co-authored an interpretive history of Asian American organizing called The Snake Dance of Asian American Activism, and recently authored a history of Boston Chinatown, Forever Struggle. Kent Wong is the director of the UCLA Labor Center, where he teaches labor studies and ethnic studies. Kent is the founding president of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, AFL-CIO, the first national organization of Asian American union members and workers. He's a vice president of the California Federation of Teachers, representing 120,000 teachers and educational workers. Kent also served as the founding president of the United Association for Labor Education, the national organization representing university-based labor centers and union educators. Before joining the UCLA Labor Center, Kent worked as a staff attorney for the Service Employees International Union in Los Angeles. He also served as the first staff attorney for Asian Americans advancing justice in Los Angeles, the largest Asian American civil rights organization in the country. Kent has published more than a dozen books on the labor movement, immigrant rights, popular education, and the Asian American community. He is married to Li Wong, a community organizer, and they have two sons, Ryan and Robin. All right. So before we begin, I'd just like to remind everyone that though our shelter and solidarity conversations typically start with a dialogue with our invited guest speakers, as always, we aim to inspire a community conversation. So we hope that you can keep a list of your own questions and comments, which you can either enter into the Zoom chat box, Facebook Live show page, or direct message me or one of my co-producers we will work with you to get you into the conversation as soon as we can. Around 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we're hoping to transition to Q&A with our audience. And as usual, a reminder to keep your mics muted unless you're speaking. All right. So without further ado, I'm just going to dive right into our subject. In the past year, reports of harassment and physical assaults of people of Asian descent have been surging in the US. The group Stop AAPI Hate, a national coalition formed this past year to address anti-Asian discrimination during the pandemic, has received over 6,600 such reports over this past year, coming from all 50 states. Another study of official preliminary police data by Cal State University at San Bernardino showed that anti-Asian hate crime in America's 16 largest cities increased 149% in 2020. The city of New York, for instance, logged over 200 anti-Asian hate crimes and bias incidents in 2020, up from only 30 the previous year. Incidents reported nationwide have ranged from shunning, verbal slurs, attacks on homes and businesses and in public places, as well as physical and in some cases, lethal violence. Many Asians are fearful for their safety, even as some people continue to doubt that these incidents even add up to a wave of anti-Asian racism. What's your assessment of the situation, and how do you think we can make sense of this rise in reported incidents in the past year? Michael?
Well, obviously it's a very horrific situation. And I think, for a long time, like it's, I think flown under the radar. I think people don't take much notice of Asian Americans or such situation Asian Americans face. But I think like the hate toward Asians actually has many different roots. I think often Asian Americans are scapegoats during times of anxiety and stress. You go back to the Chinese Exclusion Act that was preceded by the Panic of 1873. So there was economic depression. You think about the internment and World War II. You think about the killing of Vincent Chin that was a lot during the time of deindustrialization of the United States. So I think so I think our national anxiety preys upon the Asian American community as a natural target. And I also think that, but I think that there's a particular character to hate against Asians, which is a little bit different in that it's related to who we as a country have become. If you think about how the images of Asians have evolved, it all came from, just as the images of African Americans related to justify slavery, the images of Asians is related to justifying imperialism. That you think of the Opium War, to justify the trade the United States participated in, to justify the Spanish American War that colonized the Philippines. the Korean War, the Vietnam War. So to justify the intrusion, exploitation, and subjugation of all these people, I think that these images of Asian Americans is all rooted in that. So I think it's very deep, and I think that it comes to surface during these periods of anxiety.
Okay, thank you, Michael, for that. Kent?
I completely agree with everything that Michael raised. I do think that historically, anti-Asian violence and anti-Asian hate have always been with us, and it has historically been underreported and invisible. And so I do think that the current wave of anti-Asian hate and violence is at a time when there is a heightened consciousness with regard to racial injustice, specifically based on the movement for Black Lives. I think there has been a national mobilization and international mobilization that has called out white supremacy and the systemic racism that is so deeply ingrained in US society. And so I do think that the wave of anti-Asian violence has to be understood in the broader context of the attacks on all communities of color, the mass incarceration impacting Black and brown sisters and brothers, the situation of fierce anti-immigrant hysteria, the caging of children at the border, the Muslim ban. I think all of these are very much related to a white supremacist culture within our society that in many ways has been given a justification and support under the 4 years of the prior administration. So I do think that these have all contributed to heightened hostility against Asian Pacific Americans, but also greater consciousness not only within the Asian Pacific American community, but the broader community at large.
Okay, great. So actually, we have a sub-question. Alice,
Yeah.
would you like to ask that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Ken, I think you bring up a great point here that we can't have a limited perspective when we're looking at both the problem and the solution of this recent wave of violence. And I think that is particularly clear when we're looking at solutions and we're placing that in perspective with sort of abolitionist calls against police lately. So most of the perpetrators of this recent wave of attacks are private individuals, not official state or organizational actors. However, abolitionists warn against, in response, seeking safety looking for safety from the state or for police, and thus pitting the AAPI community against calls for abolition. And we've seen that historically, for example, in 2017, the death of Yang Song, a New York City massage worker who was killed during an NYPD raid. It shows us that we aren't exempt from police brutality. And when we're thinking about solutions, I wanted to ask both Ken and Michael how we can keep our collective response and critique focused on combating the underlying structural racism as opposed to, for example, racist beliefs or actions of individuals.
Well, I think that's, I think that's a very difficult situation. And I've been involved with discussions, primarily with local organizations about how to respond. But I think because I would say like in the community, there's been a range of responses, from the more conservative elements, particularly more well-to-do elements that rely on, law enforcement, to I think the more progressive elements that are looking at structural solutions. But the problem is the structural solutions are long-term, and I think that a lot of people are really fearful. I mean, I know of a member of CPA, an elderly man who went out to go grocery shopping early in the pandemic. He was spit upon, and since that time he's been fearful of coming out of the apartment. So I think there's a lot of fear. So I think that, and I think the problem is, I think for community organizations, their first responsibility is to assure the safety of their constituency. And so the thing is, long-term solutions aren't and don't provide immediate answer to what they're facing. And so I think that there needs to be more, and I know people struggle with this, more immediate solutions that answer some of these things. There have been some ideas, but I don't think too many of them are very satisfactory. So while I don't disagree with the idea, the need to change the structure and change the culture, we also need other more immediate things.
Okay, so Kent, do you have anything to say to that?
From my perspective, I do think that this is a critical time for the Asian Pacific American community, and there are tremendous organizing opportunities. The Asian Pacific American community has a higher concentration of immigrants than even the Latino community in this country. There are 22 million Asian and Americans and Pacific Islanders. We are the fastest growing ethnic community in the country. And the reason why we even exist as a community is based on the civil rights movement of the 1960s that struck down racially discriminatory immigration policies that resulted in a massive influx of Asian Pacific Americans. And so that was not too long ago, back in 1965, when the racist immigration laws were challenged, and we saw a massive influx of Asian immigrants. And so I do think that this is a time of tremendous opportunity for education, for organizing, and for mobilizing. And I do think in particular, there's a tremendous upsurge in activity among Asian American young people and activists that I find very encouraging. I do see that so many of our students at UCLA, so many of the students that we work with in the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance and young activists understand the deep relationships between structural inequality and racism and oppression, and see the role of the Asian Pacific community in a much broader context of fighting for liberation and justice. And so I think that this is a moment that we really need to critically advance mass movements and organizing and creating conditions for broader movements for social justice and social change.
All right, great. That sounds very promising. And so I just have one more question. And it's actually a little bit of a personal question. One of the issues I've been grappling with throughout the pandemic has been the relative invisibility of anti-Asian racism in the US. And in the early months of the pandemic and large-scale quarantine measures, I kept seeing news reports of attacks on Asian people scattered here and there, and grew increasingly alarmed by the steady uptick of stories, firsthand accounts, and graphic videos of physical assaults. And yet I struggled with this weird sense of unreality, like wondering if the incidents amounted to more than just coincidence. And even sometimes felt ashamed of speaking up about anti-Asian racism, especially in light of the model minority stereotype. And I know that I'm not alone in this kind of shame and reluctance to speak about Asian Americans' place in the US racial hierarchy, and have seen the national statistics about Asian Americans' high median income compared to other racial groups. So I'm wondering if you can address some of the issues around the invisibility of anti-Asian racism, and if you might provide any guidance for activists and allies. Michael or Kent?
I was going to punt it to Kent.
I'm happy to start, and then I would, invite Michael and Alice to add. I do think that this is a time when we need to lift up the voices of Asian Pacific Americans, and we need to validate, and we need to support, and we need to provide context for what is going on. It is heavy that there is such deep fear within the Asian Pacific American community. It is heavy when our elderly are being singled out for attack, and it's painful. It is indeed a moment of reckoning for not only the Asian Pacific American community, but for our society at large. How could it be that the white racist president who lied to the American people about the pandemic, who lied to the American people about the results of the 2020 election and continued to lie to this day, how could it be that he received 74 million votes? And I directly attribute part of the spike in anti-Asian violence to this continued narrative that China and that Asian Americans are to blame for the coronavirus. And this was parroted by the right-wing media. This was parroted by members of the administration, members of the Republican Party. We have a national Republican Party that is embracing white supremacy and horrendous policies that are calling for intense exploitation and abuse of communities of color throughout this country, that is nakedly embracing the lie of the Trump administration that the 2020 election was stolen. So this is the context that we have to deal with. We have to lift up the voices. We have to affirm what is really happening, and that, yes, there is a lot of shame. There's a denial. There's a sense that, how could this be happening? How could members of our community be afraid to leave their apartments, be afraid to leave their homes because of what might happen to them? And yet that is exactly what's happening. And we need to seize upon this moment to validate that concern, to validate those fears, and to organize and to put it in a broader context that, this is not an isolated incident of one problem of racial injustice and racial hatred. This is embedded in US history. This is embedded in the genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement of African Americans. This is embedded in a white racist culture that to this day has never come clean on the legacy of slavery and the legacy of genocide facing Native Americans. So how could we expect that Asians would be treated any differently? So I do think that that this is an opportunity for us to educate, to organize, and to mobilize our communities like never before.
Yeah.
All right, great. Oh, sorry, Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to add that. Yeah, I think the invisibility of Asian Americans historically, I think is I kind of relate to the point I was kind of trying to raise earlier about its integration with the U.S. history of imperialism. I think that that when the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, right? It's not simply that Chinese weren't allowed to immigrate. It was that they were also could never become citizens, that they were permanent aliens in this country, so that they were never seen as part of the United States. And so that nor were all of the the subsequent other Asian ethnicities that came afterwards, because it was like everything is tied up with what is the U.S. relationship with these countries overseas. So I think that, I think that and I think for the U.S. to face up to racism against Asians, it has to face up to its role in the world today. And I think that's very difficult. But let me just say that, in terms of being, I agree with Kent that the thing is to organize. I would just say locally where I am, I think, Kent maybe has a more national picture, but that in the Boston area, I feel that the organizing in Boston, that the most active, if not one of the most active, if not the most active neighborhood is perceived in Boston to be Chinatown. And that's because of the history of organizing over the decades. And it's partly, the reason why I wrote the book. And I think that that's brought, Asians to more prominence in the city, in certain spheres. So I think in order to be noticed, not to be invisible, we do have to organize. And I again agree with Kent that I'm also inspired by young people. I think in the same way, because I think also Kent is a child of the 60s and 70s when we say, we want to be equal like everybody else. I think young people today, young Asians, they said, you can't treat us like this. You can't, invisibilize us. So I think that that's really been inspiring to watch, and I hope to continue. It's hard work though.
Yeah, thanks for both of your comments on that. And I definitely think that you gave really good guidance for how to not become invisible, right? How to get out of that invisibility through organizing and building, and especially with young people. So
Can I
thank
just
you.
interject with a couple of models in Boston, which I'm so
Sure.
inspired by? Jessica Tang is the first woman of color to ever lead the Boston Teachers Union. This is amazing, to have a young Asian woman be the president of one of the largest unions in the city of Boston is historic. And she is building a dynamic, progressive, organizing union in Boston. Darlene Lombos is a woman of color, the first to lead the Boston Central Labor Council, and is doing extraordinary work to forge labor and community alliances and to shake up the labor movement so it truly embraces immigrant workers, workers of color, women workers, young workers. And we now have a woman of color leading the Boston Labor Council. So I think that change is happening. And everywhere we go, we see a new generation of leaders and activists who are standing up within the Asian Pacific Islander community. And this is the time when we need to make sure that their voices are heard and that the message that they are emanating resonates and mobilizes our community.
Thank you for that, Kent. Alice, do you have the next question ready?
Yeah, thank you for your answer so far. For this next question, I do want to kind of dig in on both of you have touched on the ways in which the AAPI community has already responded and sort of stepped up to this moment. And so I kind of want to ask about the concrete ways that Kent and Michael, your respective communities and cities and coalitions are responding. Michael, you talked about community organizations really prioritizing sort of safety in this moment in the present. So sort of, yeah, what are responses and resistances, and in what ways are you seeing people being galvanized to build power and solidarity? And in particular, as a young person, a young organizer, and whose parents have very different political beliefs from mine, I'm curious about your thoughts on how we can really build a truly intergenerational movement in which, young people are protecting and learning from our elders, and at the same time, young people are really providing, Kent, like you said, that sort of inspiration and energy and new ways of organizing and movement building. So yeah, Kent, I don't know if you want to start just because it's a nice follow-up.
I do really want to highlight what is happening within progressive sectors of the US labor movement. And the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance has our national convention. It'll be online, so everybody can join us this August. But here in California, where we have the largest concentration of Asian American workers in the country, here in Los Angeles County, where we have the largest concentration of Asian American workers within a city or a county, I see tremendous organizing that's taking place. And the home care union here in California is led by women of color. It was a campaign that was launched by Black women, and 74,000 mainly women of color organized the union here in Los Angeles County. Now more than 300,000 home care workers are under union contract in the state of California, and the union meetings are dynamic. They're held in Chinese, in Korean, in Armenian, in Spanish. It's one of the most diverse memberships of any union in the country. We see organizing happening like we've never seen in recent years. I mean, this wave of teacher strikes a couple of years ago, tens of thousands of teachers took to the streets in Los Angeles and shook up the city, not only to demand better wages and working conditions for teachers, but more importantly, to demand quality public education. And they were supported by millions of people here in Los Angeles and California, because people saw the power of teachers organizing and standing together. We see this new generation of young workers, including fast food workers, Uber and Lyft drivers, warehouse workers, who are getting tired of entering the workforce for low-wage jobs with no future, while you have the wealthiest corporations making billions during the pandemic. So what's wrong with this picture? What's wrong with this picture when you have corporate leaders who are making more money off the pandemic, parasites, and yet the workers who are creating the wealth for those corporations are being paid poverty wages with no benefits? So I think that there is a lot of organizing taking place, especially among immigrant workers and workers of color and women workers and young workers. So this is going to lead, in my view, to the revitalization of the US labor movement.
All right, great. Thanks for that, Kent. And Michael, do you have anything to say to that?
Well, I guess I don't have quite as optimistic a assessment of the situation, I guess. I recently went to a rally against racist violence against Asians. And then later on, I found the same day that there was 3 other rallies on the, against violence against Asians in the city that same day. And, maybe it's a result of social media where everybody feels like it's put out thing on Facebook, and then, you can organize your own rally instead of people trying to build a coalition. But I see, like, there's been a range of responses that different people have. And I think that because of a lot of organizing that that's gone on in the past, that, there's been things like policy responses, like a lot of, I think organizations, national networks have put out policy papers, suggestions about what to do, as well as, aware of the hate crime bill that was just signed by Biden. And there's also a similar bill in, Massachusetts State House. And I think there's questions about those bills because, it basically, kind of builds up the law enforcement thing. The positive thing about it is that it tracks hate crimes with more precision. But I would say locally, so there's been organizations and local coalitions that have been focused on, these policy recommendations, as I mentioned, somewhat addressing structural issues. And I think that local, so, I think you all probably aware that, also in local communities, people have been trying to organize things like more like self-help, self-defense type of things, like community patrols, or the largest social service organization in New York City distributed alarms for the elderly to carry around with them. Here I've been working with people about trying to do bystander intervention training, to de-escalate things. I know locally in the Vietnamese community that they're teaching self-defense to the seniors. And they're also doing de-escalation training in the nail salons. So I think there's all these scattered efforts, and there's like not. I wish there was a more unified response, but I feel like we don't. Not just Asians, but I think we in the left don't quite have the infrastructure and the organization that we need to have a better response to these type of issues, as well as issues like, Black Lives Matter, and to be more directed and more effective. So, but I think things are getting a little bit sharper, and things are getting better, and people are converging on some ideas. But right now it's not real good. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Oh,
go,
Linda,
Alice.
if I can just respond real quick. I mean, it's really interesting to hear that perspective, Michael, especially because being in Houston, I kind of, I think it's also been somewhat of a scattered response. It certainly hasn't been unified. And I was wondering if it was just because the Houston, especially sort of AAPI organizing in Houston it's much more nascent compared to New York or California. But it's interesting that, being based in the Northeast, you've also sort of had that perspective. Go ahead, Linda.
Yeah, well, I think it's rooted in, well, you probably know, like this, there's been a big split. I mean, in the Chinese, I don't know to what extent it's also true for other Asian ethnicities, but, because there's a sector, like particularly associated with Falun Gong that have supported Trump, right? And so there's a sector that does that, and of course their response to these things are more like, let's get more police. So I think it's a very I think there's things we have to deal with in the Chinese and Asian communities.
That's really interesting, Michael, because my next question was actually going to be about the question of unity and also disunity when it comes to Asians and Asian Americans, and so I've been seeing the term Asian American in a number of venues responding to the attacks of the past year, including news media and solidarity statements issued by various groups and institutions. And many of these venues use Asian American to point to the shared vulnerability of Asian people in the US to racism, despite the fact that people of Asian descent in the US are of heterogeneous classes, ethnicities, nationalities, as well as immigrant documentation and generational statuses. As the recent New York Times article put it, the past year's violence has known no boundaries, spanning generations, income brackets, and regions. So how do you understand this appeal to some kind of unified Asian American identity? Do you think this identity category is monolithic and obscures differences that really matter and have an impact in people's lives? Or do you see it in more productive terms? So Kent or Michael?
There is indeed tremendous diversity within the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. Dozens of nationalities, dozens of languages, as you indicated, socioeconomic, educational background, all over the map. On the one hand, Asian Americans, as you indicated earlier, have relatively high family income. Again, some of this is skewed because Asians tend to live in multi-generational units more than non-Asians, tend to be more geographically concentrated in major cities where cost of living and income are higher than rural areas. So it's very challenging to paint these broad pictures of what is the Asian American community without delving more deeply into a disaggregation of that information. So I do see that, yes, it's challenging, when you talk about the Asian American community, because it is not one community. And when you deal with large numbers of immigrants, they would ask, well, why are you, bracketing me with that other group over there? We don't have anything in common with them. The reality, however, is that, as you said, during this time of heightened attacks, heightened anti-Asian violence, it doesn't really matter, what country you're from. It doesn't matter how many generations you may have been here in this country. You are potentially open for attack. And I do think that this is a teaching and a learning opportunity for the Asian American community at large to have a much deeper understanding of our collective history. And the Chinese Exclusion Act, although it was passed in 1882, it applied to Asians across the board, and it existed on the books of this country for more than 80 years. So we have to understand the nature of white supremacy and the nature of institutional racism, that it impacts all API subgroups. So I do think that part of the education to members of our extended community is to understand there are, in fact, shared aspects of our collective history, and a definite benefit for the Asian and American and Pacific Islander community to stand together and to organize together and to fight together.
Yeah, I think generally the Asian American term is papers over differences, and here in Massachusetts we had a multi-year fight over disaggregation of data concerning Asians, which has not come to a conclusion yet. But I think as far as this issue, it's not, as Ken indicated, I don't think it's that big a deal, because I think that people this show, people who are Filipino, Vietnamese, Thai have been killed or slashed with box cutters because and told to go back to China. So as well as a lot of Chinese. So yeah, on this issue, I think in a sense society does force us into the box of Asian American. So yeah, so I guess on this issue I'm not as worried about it, though generally I think it is a problem because there's a lot of diversity in our communities.
I want to ask about a somewhat of a different form of disaggregation, and that is the differences in geography within the AAPI community. So, Boston, where Michael, your recent book is based, versus Los Angeles, where Kent is based, versus Houston, where I am currently, obviously have very different contexts and histories, and maybe sort of flashpoints that local communities could organize around. And so I kind of want to ask about your opinions about, and not that of course it's an either or, but maybe just the pros and cons and how they interrelate of local organizing, so local direct action and mutual aid, versus more of a national movement and coalition building, and how maybe both of these strategies can interplay in terms of, Michael, you're saying finding somewhat more of a cohesive strategy of response.
Yeah, I guess we had to try to do both, but I think that the problem is, I mean, if we do something nationally, it would just be among like, I think the, the leadership, and I think, but to really, I think, build a base, I think you really have to, work locally. And so I think, I think one problem I see, I mean, again, this is local though, and it's not particular to the Asian communities, but I actually see, because we work with, Latinx and African American groups, but I see since I was active that there are fewer base building groups that are active today. I mean, they're different, uh, in those communities, and I think that we need more of those things. So I guess I would put the emphasis on local, but obviously the national networks and you know, play a very important role. So I think we have to try to do both.
If I could just draw briefly on our experience with the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, I do think that there is tremendous benefit in building local power, in working to transform unions to embrace a progressive vision for the future and to concentrate resources on organizing the unorganized and in building labor community alliances around a common agenda. So I see tremendous benefit at a local level in building progressive, dynamic, democratic unions. At the same time, I see tremendous benefit in linking those organizing efforts, both sectorally. So there's been a huge increase in organizing of Asian American workers in the healthcare sector throughout the country, in the home care sector throughout the country, in the public sector, in the field of education. And so in targeted sectors and in targeted parts of the workforce, we have seen a huge growth in the number of Asian American union members, which is very encouraging. And if we can share successful models and to influence the local political scene, we can also begin to shape and influence the regional and the national political scene. So I do think that the fact that labor played such a prominent role in defeating Trump in November 2020, in securing a razor-thin majority in the Senate. But this was a coalition between labor and communities of color that succeeded in changing the national political agenda. So the only reason today that we're having conversations about the stimulus package, we're having conversations about immigration reform, we're having conversations about racial justice, it is because of the change in the political environment nationally. So I do think that we need to look at how we can link our organizing at the local level with a regional and national level as well.
All right, great. Thanks for that, Michael and Kent. So I have just another question about the category of Asian American. So there are some similarities and differences between the 1960s social movement roots of the term Asian American and the ways in which the term is being used today. For instance, the Asian American movement sought to build coalitions between Asians of various ethnicities and nationalities around shared experiences of oppression and discrimination. And so we might say that something similar is going on today in response to rising anti-Asian hate incidents, but I'm not so sure that we can trace a straightforward lineage between contemporary Asian American organizing and that of the 60s and 70s. And I'm wondering if you think there are any significant similarities and differences between then and now. Michael?
Yes, well, obviously, the population is, much more diverse. I mean, not just in terms of Asian ethnicities, but also in terms of class. I mean, it is true. Like in the '60s, and when I first became active, it actually built upon the at that time, I think about 70% of the uh, working population in the Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino, which were the major groups, were in laboring or service occupations. So since the effects of the '65 um, Immigration Reform Act, you know, along with family reunification, it privileged skilled and professional and managerial sectors. So you had a large influx of those people, as well as the fact that some of the children of the working class went on to college. So that right now um, you do have a large well-off uh, sector in the suburbs and so on. And but I just and so that's really affected what the statistic people are talking about, this median income thing. But if you look at Boston, I mean, and I think it's true nationally that it's very bipolar, because at the same time that you know Asians have a high median income in the state, the Asians have the lowest median income in the city of Boston. So so this sector still exists, but probably is a small percentage. So therefore, it makes it much more difficult to organize. Uh, but I don't know. Another big difference is, I would say, is that right now that young activists are working with the I guess the fruits of what happened in the '60s, and so that there's this nonprofit industrial complex. But at the time that I was active, right, and began to be active, there was no service organizations in Chinatown. There was no community groups hardly, except for the traditional ones, the family associations and so on. And so that those organizations are both, I would say, primarily a strength, but it's also a hindrance to organizing today. So yeah, I think there are significant differences. I guess like the main similarity I see is the vitality of youth.
I would agree with what Michael raised about the complexity of the Asian Pacific American community, the diversity, the broad spectrum in terms of socioeconomic status, and the large numbers of professional workers within the Asian American community, and the large percentage of entrepreneurs and business people. And at the same time, you have some of the highest concentrations of poverty among other Asian subgroups, and other Asians concentrated in certain occupations. So there is that bipolar nature to the broader Asian American community. Getting back to Linda's question in terms of the genesis of the term Asian American was a political construct. It was a way of organizing the Pan-Asian community in solidarity with the rising Black consciousness within this country, the rising Chicano movement in this country, and to identify with communities of color who are struggling for justice. And so I do think that in that sense, there are certain parallels between this new upsurge of young activists within the Asian American community who have a much stronger intersectional approach, and understand that what is impacting the Asian American community has direct impact on Black Lives Matter, has a direct impact on the fight for immigrant rights, the fight for against the Muslim ban. So there is an understanding of the broader forces within our society that perpetuate white supremacy. So I do think that in that sense, there is a renewed activism within young people that are looking at a much broader set of conditions and a broader context than in the past.
All right, great. Thank you so much for your responses to that. And I'm just looking at the time here. We are 5 minutes to 8, but I think we can get one more full question in before we turn to the audience for Q&A. Okay, so actually this next question is for my co-host, Alice. So Alice is currently a co-director of West Street Recovery, a horizontally organized grassroots group using rebuild and recovery efforts after disaster to build community power. And she's also done lots of other social organizing, labor union, and climate justice work in Houston. And much of her work has been with Black and Latinx people. So Alice, I'm wondering if you can tell us about your experience organizing in spaces where there are not that many Asians and Asian Americans. And do you identify with any of the terms we've been using so far in this show, Asian, Asian American, Pacific Islander, or person of Asian descent?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I predominantly identify as Chinese American, but also Asian American to a somewhat lesser extent, just because most of my sort of connection with my identity is through my family directly, as opposed to like you said, sort of organizing in this broader context. And I think this is an interesting question because as you know, since I've been an organizer and I first sort of started off in the climate movement when I was in high school, and then moving on to sort of engaging in issues that the broader left is concerned with in college. And I think there was a disconnect, and I was engaging in this sort of setting aside of my own personal identity and sort of engaging as a young person generally, or as a leftist generally. The climate movement has come a long way just in the past 6 or 7 years. But when I first joined, it was a very white space. And now, like you said, at West Street Recovery, we work predominantly in a community in Northeast Houston, where there's 3% white people and about 60 to 7% Black people. And I think this is a question that I'm absolutely still thinking about and still working through, but I feel like I'm, especially recently, I'm starting with, and this has been sort of repeated again and again throughout this conversation, but the broader context and the coalitions and being a part of, not just, I think like you kind of have to pull out specific parts of what it means to be a part of the AAPI community. For example, when you think about being immigrants, right? Like what are, then there's a very direct connection between what our Latinx brothers and sisters are going through right now, being deported, being locked up. There's a direct connection to the Muslim ban. And when you think about the legacies of imperialism that so many of our home countries have faced, then there's a direct connection to, for example, Palestinian liberation currently. And so I do think it comes from looking at history and looking at present day coalitions as well. Like I said, I think on a more personal level, there is still a very big disconnect just with the differences of political beliefs between me and my parents. And that is an open question that I'm still thinking about.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. Letting us in on some of your personal experiences organizing in these spaces, and also kind of telling us a little bit about your family, right, and how right you have to set aside some of your past, or uh, your identification, right, with your family. So thanks for letting us know more about your organizing experience. And I think now should we move on to Q&A, or okay, let's move on to Q&A. So if you have any questions, please post them in the chat box, or you can direct message me or raise your hand, and I will try to call on you based on the order that they were submitted. Okay. So, Victor. Victor, I think you're muted.
Thank you for this interesting and important discussion. I'd like to introduce a dimension that hasn't been touched on yet, and that is the geopolitical dimension, the US government's rivalry with China and its constant attempts to demonize China in more and more ways. And I wanted especially to recommend sources like the Gray Zone, individual travelers to China, like one I came across named Daniel Dumbrill, whom I had not heard of before, a Canadian who's lived in China for 12 years and who's visited Xinjiang and made a lot of sort of direct contacts. The demystification of China, the direct contact people to people, is so important. And I mean, historically in this country, the anti-Chinese and the anti-communist dimensions have merged and been very dangerous. And part of deconstructing or undoing the anti-Chinese pressure is challenging the U.S. government's hostility towards the Chinese regime. And I mean, we can have a completely open-minded approach to the Chinese system. There are some interesting debates, for example, that are expressed actually in a reader that I just received from one of our audience members here, Duncan McFarland, who's done a nice China reader, which can be very useful. But there are many sources and there are many different points of view. But I think what's in common, and I think generally recognized, including by commentators who are not particularly radical in this country, is including in a Harvard study a few years ago, that the general level of contentment in the population of China is greater than that in the United States. And that surprises some people, but it says something about the Chinese government, which is worth knowing. And so I think in combating the anti-Asian racism, challenging the negative stereotypes about China, and talking about the direct experience of the people there, as Daniel Dumbrill has done, is very important. So I wanted to throw that out as a comment, and I'm interested in the responses of our guests.
Thank you, Victor, for that comment. I've actually done a lot of work in trying to build labor solidarity between US unions and Chinese unions over the past 20 years. And the very issues that you have raised are a reflection of the Cold War framework, the anti-communism, and the anti-China bias that is so deeply ingrained within the US government, both Democrats and Republicans. So it was absolutely off the charts during the Trump years when he blamed China for the COVID-19 crisis and did everything he could to inflame hostile, racist images of China, and the language that he used was very blatantly racist. And so, we see that extreme. However, we see, democratic administrations as well who have embraced this very hostile Cold War perspective with regard to China. And we see how this has a direct negative consequence with regard to perceptions of the Chinese American and the Asian American community. So I do think that when we talk about this broader issue of anti-Asian sentiment and anti-Asian violence, as Michael said earlier, it's directly linked to US policy in the Vietnam War, US policy in the Cold War against China, the Korean War, the World War II, when 120,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to concentration camps, when no similar mass evacuation took place within the German and Italian American communities. So I do think that the emerging conflicts and the worsening of relationships between US and China not only are very short-sighted and stand in opposition to the interests of workers in this country, but it also has a particular negative ramifications with regard to the Chinese and Asian American community.
Thank you.
Yes,
All right. Yes.
I just want
Michael,
to,
please go.
I completely agree with what Ken just said. And I just want to note that actually, yeah, I mean, how Chinese Americans are treated, I think is really related to, what's the relationship between China and the US. And, after the communist victory in 1949, there was a hunt on in the Chinatowns. And I distinctly remember signs going up on the community bulletin boards telling people to report to the FBI if they see any people, expressing any sentiments toward China, which is why there was, for decades, there was no contact at all between the US and China.
Okay, thank you, Michael and Kent. I think we are going to move on to Joseph Nevins, who has a question. Joseph?
Yeah, I was having trouble unmuting myself.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about the delay. Thank you. And thank you to our guests for a really stimulating conversation. Before I ask my question, I just want to piggyback on Victor's observation. I was watching part of the debate yesterday in the House of Representatives regarding the establishment of the January 6th investigation body. And I can't remember which Democrat it was, but one of the Democrats got up and made this very stirring, energized speech, slamming the vast majority of Republicans for not supporting, this body. And one of his reasons for establishing the body, he said, was because it would be an important, without the United States investigating this properly, it would undermine US ability to challenge China. Right? So there it is, right in the heart of the Democratic Party, this constant saber rattling, chauvinism. It's really sickening. We know this, but we really have to go after the Democratic establishment on this and how they're feeding this. All right, so that's how. Now my question, and it's partly inspired by something Alice asked regarding geography. And I'm wondering, like, in thinking about the, if we could map the wave of anti-Asian violence that's unfolded in, over the last year or so, do we see any significant variation? So, Kent and Michael, you both spoke very powerfully about how, assorted national history and imperial history has played into this, right? This is sort of the fertile soil out of which it grows. I'm wondering, does locality matter at all? Like in thinking about where it's been most intense or, less important, or, it's manifested itself less. So like, does Los Angeles, the specifics of Los Angeles or Houston or Boston, help us understand what's going on in terms of the broad picture and the local picture?
So thank you for that question, Joseph. The unfortunate reality is that anti-Asian violence and anti-Asian crimes have increased throughout the country, and in areas that we may not have expected it to occur. In the San Francisco Bay Area, horrendous instances of anti-Asian violence in one of the oldest and most established Chinese American and Asian American communities in the country. New York, in spite of the long, rich tradition of Chinese and Asian Americans, horrendous reports of anti-Asian violence. And, of course, the killing of 6 Asian American women in Atlanta in March of this year. So it is a national phenomenon. It is in areas where Asian Americans have been part of the landscape for generations. But I do think it addresses this earlier point that has been raised about how Asians have historically been viewed as others, as aliens, as inherently un-American. And even though I am a 3rd generation Chinese American, even though my family came to this country over 100 years ago, I can't tell you how many times people tell me to go back to where I came from. I can't tell you how many times people question my citizenship, question my status. I've done a lot of work with undocumented students over the years, and the level of vitriolic racist hate that fills my emails is staggering. And people saying that I should be deported along with my students. I said, well, that's interesting. I think that it would be helpful for some of you to read the US Constitution. It is so easy to look at an Asian face and make an assessment and a determination that we are not American.
Yeah, my understanding, I really haven't studied this in great depth, but my understanding is that the worst concentration of incidents is in New York and California. And I think it may be related to the concentration of Asians in those localities. I think, usually I think when people of color are in communities, if there's only a few, then it's not seen as a threat. But I think with these larger numbers, and people are concerned about changes to the status quo to accommodate them, then I think they're perceived as a greater threat. So, but I think someone should, take a look at that in more detail.
Okay. So actually, there are reports that have been put out that look at this very thing in detail. Actually, the Stop AAPI Hate coalition, national coalition that I mentioned earlier, has been gathering reports from all over the nation, and they also sort of tabulate which states have the most and which cities have the most, and they rank them. So somebody could put that in the chat box, that would be great. All right. Okay, so I think we have Tim Sheard, who actually wanted me to ask a question for him. Okay. So Tim's question is, do you feel that the trafficking of young Asian women for placement in abusive domestic service positions, massage parlors, or brothels is also an aspect of anti-Asian violence, and should it be part of the overall mobilization for human rights?
Thank you for that question, Tim. And I'm really glad you lifted up this aspect, because a really critical part of anti-Asian hate and anti-Asian violence is deeply connected to misogyny and to the degradation and belittlement and depiction of Asian women in very demeaning and very racist ways. And unfortunately, it links again to U.S. Imperialism, the stationing of hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops in Vietnam, in other parts of Asia, have directly contributed to this view of Asian women as exotic, as as people to be abused and exploited sexually. And so I do think that this is absolutely a part of the problems of anti-Asian violence that we are addressing throughout the country. And it's a serious concern with regard to sex trafficking, with regard to the exploitation and abuse of Asian immigrants and other women who have been exploited for many generations in this country.
Okay, Michael, would you like to speak to that?
No, I don't know enough to comment.
Okay, all right, great. Thank you very much. And Tim, do you think he answered your question?
I do think so, and I just wanted to give a plug to Affirm, which is a mainly Filipino but also international anti-trafficking, radical feminist, anti-capitalist grassroots organization. You probably know of them on the West Coast. They're active in many of our cities, and it's really important part of the fight for fighting anti-Asian violence is fighting the trafficking and the abuse of Asian women.
All right, great. So Druba has a question. Druba, do you want to unmute yourself?
Oh, I was trying to unmute myself.
Okay.
So yeah, to start with, I would like to draw your attention to one fact that whenever Asian American, this term is used, West Asian and South Asians, most of the time they're excluded from that. And why that I don't know. And secondly, in the Boston area, we are forming a group called BAIL, United Against White Supremacy. BAIL is Black, Asian, Indigenous, and Latinx. There's a small group. It is primarily educating people and having some unifying rallies so that we can basically send the message that fight against white supremacy is something which unites all of us, all four groups. But then again, within Asian community, there are various subgroups, and even within Blacks, there are subgroups. So we are just trying to unite, start a unifying movement based on that. So I was looking for some help from the East Asian descent. We have many from the other groups, from the BAIL. So that would be very helpful. And I would still want to know, why West Asian and South Asians are usually excluded when referring to Asian Americans. Thank you.
Daruba, thank you very much for your comment tonight. And this is a serious concern within the broader Asian American community, where we need to make more efforts. We need to be more intentional in being inclusive. This has been a major issue within the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. We have taken great steps to try to ensure that our leadership is representative of all Asian communities, including South Asian communities. We want to make sure that with regard to language rights and inclusion of various Asian groups, that we pay attention to ensuring that we provide, interpretation and translation in critical Asian languages, and that when we develop organizing campaigns and when we reach out to various communities of color, that we be very intentional in ensuring that the organizing committee is reflective of the diversity of the workers, that the leadership is reflective of that diversity as well. So it is something that we still need to work on, and I agree that it is a problem with regard to a bias towards East Asians with regard to the broader Asian American community.
Yeah, I think we need to make efforts to be inclusive. I think I think the Asian American Resource Workshop locally has really incorporated a lot of South Asian, I'm not sure about West Asian, South Asian activists. So and I think and also I think locally, I think most of the groups I know of that are South Asian are focused on domestic violence. But if you could forward your information, but I think generally, yeah, I mean, we need to work harder. I mean, the origins of the Asian American term, as I mentioned, came out of the three largest groups at those times, in the 60s. So I think it's been, it's a work in progress to make it more inclusive.
All right, great, thank you. And we have another question from one of our co-producers, Saran Mudliar.
Thank you, Linda. I have a question for Michael, and it follows on the last question in some respects, except with a historical focus. In fact, I can think of few people better than Michael to address the question, because it's one he raised in his earlier comments. Michael, you mentioned that the left as a whole lacks the infrastructure for addressing the kinds of problems we're talking about today. So in addition to mentioning the Asian American identity based groups, you spoke of the left in general. And since you've been involved in building infrastructure as well as theorizing and writing about it historically, I'm wondering, given your experience with the Rainbow Coalition, for example, was there a time when we did things better on the left in terms of the infrastructure to resist, or do you see us having to really reinvent ourselves to develop this kind of infrastructure?
I don't think I'm gonna give you a satisfactory answer because, I kind of feel like, personally, I'm retired, and I think the revolution, I think, belongs to the young people. So I just try to provide support to them. But I have to say, but yes, I felt like during certain times, I felt that we were stronger. And I don't know what, and I know that Alice belongs to a horizontally organized organization, whereas I think that in the past we had more maybe hierarchical, but I think very disciplined groups that were, working in concert. So, I'm still active, but I'm trying to understand how, kind of more like the decentralized horizontal organizations work and how they can be effective. And I participate in some, and I'm still trying to understand how it all works. So, but yeah, I feel that in the past, so most of these groups I think were Marxist influenced, and I felt that they were able to accomplish more than I, given the how much effort there was. And I see a lot of effort going on. I just don't see things kind of moving forward as quickly as maybe I would hope.
Okay, thank you, Michael. And one of our co-producers, Joe Ramsey, has a question.
I do indeed. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Alice, for hosting. And I get a break from hosting today. It's been really enjoying this. Michael and Kent, your comments have been so insightful. I've really just learned a lot, and you're helping me make a lot of connections I didn't make before. I'm very appreciative for this last hour, almost hour and a half. My question is a little bit, I was going to direct it to Michael, but Michael just got one directly to him. So I'm going to try to give it to both of you. But it's basically, I mean, I know, Michael, you just retired from UMass Boston, where I also teach, as does Linda Liu. In the English and American Studies department. And we have, in English, we have a course called Experiencing Boston, which is a kind of a experiential learning course that involves reading about the history, the literature, cultural, but also going out to site visits, engaging guest speakers. So my very sharp question, a yes or no question, which you could answer whenever you want, is would you accept an invitation to come and visit our class? Because I would really like to bring your expertise into that classroom. You don't have to answer that now, but what I'd like to hear from you, and this is the one that would be a little more open, would be as an educator or someone who has worked in an educational institution, and I understand you work in labor education out at UCLA as well, Kent. I mean, what are some of the I guess misconceptions, or if you had to boil it down to just a couple of major kind of lessons or takeaways from your research or your activism that you think needs to be imparted to kind of the next generation, not to say all students are younger, they're not at UMass Boston, but generally speaking, an institution educating the next generations. I would wonder, if you, distilling from your research, perhaps from your book, which I'm planning to read very, very soon. I haven't had a chance to read to yet. So a chance here to plug your book a bit as well, Michael. If there would be like something that you think people who might be living in Boston, going to school in Boston, undergraduates who might be watching this program later, something that would surprise them, or that you think either about the conditions that have existed in Chinatown, or about the struggles and the stories that you've learned and that you've gathered from your own work. And Kent, without knowing your institutional location as well, I guess I'd like to ask you, as an educator that seems to have, at least as I understand it, unless I'm wrong, at least a few, if not a full foot, then at least I don't know, some part of some appendage that's in the university. What do you see as the challenges or opportunities of kind of communicating these struggles in the community into the university space? Obviously, you could do a whole show on that, but if you could give us even a taste of your thinking about that, I would be grateful. And Michael, I do extend that invitation to you here publicly as well.
You can go, Ken.
So I'm actually on the faculty at UCLA, and I've been teaching labor studies and ethnic studies for many years. And in the last couple years, we have launched the very first labor studies major in the history of UCLA, but also in the history of our 9-campus University of California system. And so we're very excited about that, because we think that there is a new generation of student activists who are drawn to the field of labor studies because they see tremendous hope in organizing workers, in joining the labor movement, and working with worker centers, and in transforming a very unjust and inequitable labor scene. So I teach the core course in our labor studies class at UCLA. We have 300 students enrolled. Next month, we're going to be graduating over 100 UCLA labor studies majors and minors in our program. And many of our students go on to do extraordinary work in the labor movement, with worker centers, in politics, in community-based organizations, in policy work, in research. So I think that there is hunger among young people these days to engage in an educational environment that validates their experience, their interests, and helps to chart a career where they can find avenues to do social justice work as a career. And so the concept that we've been introducing here at UCLA at the Labor Center is this school to movement pipeline. How can we make sure that we provide opportunities for college students, for young activists who want to commit their time, energy, and resources to advance social change and social justice? How do we find career paths so that they can do that? And I think it gets to some of the concerns that Michael raised in terms of how do we institutionalize social justice work? How do we build lasting institutions that will promote worker justice, racial justice, and build long-lasting institutions in our community? The building you see behind me is the outreach office of the UCLA Labor Center. We are walking distance within 20 major unions in Los Angeles. We work deeply with communities of color, immigrant communities, unions and worker centers of Los Angeles. We just got an allocation in the state budget that was introduced by the governor last Friday for a $15 million allocation to renovate a permanent home for the UCLA Labor Center and to name our building in honor of Reverend James Lawson Jr., an iconic leader of the civil rights era who worked closely with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So in my view, that's a pathway towards building institutions, in advancing long-term social justice, and in recruiting young people to find career paths in the world of social justice.
Yeah, I just want to add, like, that sounds like a great course you're teaching. I think that yeah, one thing that would be important to me is like that is for students to learn about the people in the communities in Boston and the history. Unfortunately, except there aren't that many histories of people of color in Boston. There's Mel King's Chain of Change about the Black community up to a certain point. And there isn't a book about the Latinx community. But I think that if students can learn about the struggles and how the city was built and what happened, I think that, and how these communities survive, I think that they would, if they learned about the Rainbow Coalition, or if they learned about the fight against the Southwest Corridor, which highway that was supposed to encircle the city of Boston. I think that they would learn a lot about the structures of power and maybe alternative ways of doing things. So that's the one small thing I would suggest. But it sounds like your course is kind of doing that already. So I'm not adding much.
We're trying, but I actually have not integrated Chinatown in a way. I'm very conscious of that as a not an absence, but an inadequacy. I want to give one more plug, not only plugging your book, The Forever Struggle, but Seren Mudliar and Joseph Nevins, who's also on this call, along with Eleni Makrakis, co-authored a great book. It just came out last year, I guess. It seems like a long time ago because this has been a crazy year, but A People's Guide to Greater Boston, which I just posted the link in the chat. But I would love to have you join them in as a, even if it's just a Zoom visit to classroom, even if we're back live, Michael, it would really be great to share your.
A little tired of Zoom, so I'll come.
Come in person, okay.
All right, great. Thanks, Michael and Kent. And I am, I guess, making a last call for questions. You can put them either in the chat box or raise your hand here. Or if you are watching on Facebook Live, you can also write your question in there. All right, so Michael Hui has a question. Michael, do you have a question? Michael Hui? I think you're muted.
Okay, listening to Kent.
I am sorry about that. I kept trying to unmute myself. It kept
Oh,
saying you're not
okay.
allowed to unmute. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Oh, wait, somebody, okay, I got the,
Okay. So
So
Michael.
So when I Google Australia or Canada or Germany, I see this anti-Asian violence cropping up all over the planet. And when I've looked at Australian news, I see a man, an empire, actually Murdoch, Fox News, Sky News, whatever, seem to promote the idea that the sooner America attacks China and you know, is able to, what do you call, secure Taiwan because we're pissed off that we lost control of China back in '49, all that kind of stuff. This seems to be a yellow journalism thing like Hearst did 100 or so years ago to get us into the war with Spain and the whole thing with the Philippines and Cuba and all that. So I'm wondering if there are big players behind the scenes that are orchestrating some of this for geopolitical goals, or is it just kind of a local thing that's popping up all over the place?
Well, thank you for that question, Michael. I mean, we are in the midst of a Cold War between the United States and China. And US is doing everything they can to try to encircle China, to try to mobilize its allies in opposition to China. And the right-wing global media in particular is promoting the US analysis and the US posture in securing the US domination in the global scene. So I do think that what we see happening with the media cycle in this country in promoting a lot of anti-China messaging is being picked up by pro-US government and pro-US military forces in other parts of the world. Similarly, what we see with the US back of Israel and the attacks on the Palestinian people, we also see that right-wing message being shared and circulated in pro-US and pro-Israel media outlets throughout the globe.
Okay, Michael, do you have anything to say to that? No?
No.
Okay, all right. All right, I'm sorry. Saran has another question.
Oops. So I'm double dipping, yeah. I was really intrigued by Kent's statement or formulation of the school to movement pipeline. And I know you probably have very good answers to this, but it's one concern I have is with students who join movement organizations coming off, for the summer, say from campuses, going into movements in the communities. And I worry about a certain kind of elitism developing, where young people from the community, from the colleges, see themselves as saving the communities. And I'm certain that, given your history and even like with Michael's example too, that you're very self-conscious about this kind of a problem. But could you share with the rest of us how this kind of danger is averted?
That's a great question, Surin. And I do think that from our vantage point, the vast majority of the students within our UCLA Labor Studies program are working class students. The vast majority are women. The vast majority are students of color. The vast majority are first generation college students. And so why they are drawn to the Labor Center and why they are drawn to the field of labor studies is that it validates their family's story, it validates their family's experience. Some of the finest students that I've had over the course of my career have been undocumented immigrant students who have had to fight against tremendous barriers and obstacles to even allow them to attend a public university. And the undocumented students at UCLA have led the fight nationally for the Federal Dream Act, for deferred action for childhood arrivals, to stop the deportation of their parents. And so when they take our classes, it resonates in a whole different way, that these are not abstract things that they study about in the books. These are parts of their lived experience. And so we really are very proud of the students that have gone through our programs, who have seen their role in taking back skills, resources, knowledge to their communities to organize for change. And we see them in unions, we see them in worker centers, in community-based organizations, in government, in politics, in playing a dynamic role in helping to shape the future.
Yes, I think that there is a danger of elitism, but I think overall, like students who graduate and want to do work, well, I'm mainly talking from the community perspective, want to do work in the community is an asset. But I think that but I think that we have to, and I think that the progressive teachers that influence them are pretty strong in terms of teaching them to center those most impacted. So I think that a lot of them come out with that point of view. But I think that I've been active in another project called the Activist Training Institute that works with young people. And we've been actually, and that's been around for quite a while, but we've been struggling with the idea about we actually need to work more closely with non-English speaking immigrants to actually give them the tools that they need, or the understanding of society, in order to actually realize that thing where you can center the most impacted. So I think that probably we haven't done a good enough job of that. That we have to have more, but it's much harder because of the language and cultural issues, and also their schedules. But I think that's something we have to work harder at. But yeah, I recognize the problem, but I think there's some mitigating factors, I guess.
All right, great. Thank you, Michael and Kent. So before we end discussion tonight, I'd just like to give all three of our guests, so Michael, Kent, and Alice, a chance to give any closing comments.
I don't think I have any general closing comments, but I actually do want to hop on Saren's question just now, kind of to provide an alternative perspective. But I think as someone who, as a recent graduate from a non-public, so a private university, I did kind of experience firsthand the way in which the academy actually absorbs activism and social justice and sort of uses it for its own means or to perpetuate its own programs and its own agenda. Like at Rice, there's a lot of funding and a lot of initiatives that sort of put social justice under this label of like civic leadership or social entrepreneurship, where it becomes, as a student, you have an opportunity to be able to, quote, change the world or make a positive impact on the community, but that takes place within the framework of like capitalism, like starting a business that's good for the world, or under the framework of like programs that still very much, I would say, fail to challenge the status quo and try to solve these problems in other innovative ways. But I would say, yeah, I think, Saren, that's a really good question. As someone who's just coming out of a university, that I think where that is a danger. And I think most of the genuinely progressive, I think, like, of course, being in Houston, there's a very different academic infrastructure compared to UCLA and the UCs in general, which have an amazing history of being genuinely progressive. But I think, yeah, most of the actual organizing and movement building was definitely happening just purely on a student-led basis during the time that I was there.
Okay, great. Thanks, Alice. I'd like to imagine that you came out of Rice as a very good organizer with deep ties to the community, and you haven't been sucked into the nonprofit industrial complex. So either Kent or Michael, do you have any closing comments that you'd like to make?
I just hope we can work together in the future to build a stronger movement. That's all.
Yes, definitely. All right,
Just a
Kent?
shout out to Linda and Alice for facilitating tonight's conversation, and great to see you, Michael, and to thank everybody for joining us. I do think that this is Asian Pacific Heritage Month. This is a time when people across the country are looking at what is happening with the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, are looking at the challenges with regard to anti-Asian violence and anti-Asian hate. And I do think this is a decisive moment for the Asian American community to get organized, to lift up our voices, to join with other communities of color and other progressive movements to make the type of radical social change that is desperately needed within our society.
Great, Ken.